Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Namaste. We carry forward our summing up and discussion of the lectures. So, in Module 10, we were looking at labor market economics and conservation. And we began by saying that poverty is closely related to environmental degradation because poverty leads to less per capita resources, which leads to overpopulation, which leads to more stress on land, and then to land and environmental degradation, loss of productivity, which then continues this poverty. So essentially, poverty moves as a vicious circle. So if there is poverty in a society or in a certain section of the society, in that case, the per capita resources will be less. And when the per capita resources are less, then the productivity is also less. Because when we talk about agriculture, people do not have access to fertilizers or pesticides or high yielding varieties of seeds. So when we have less income, when we have less resources, then the crop fields also give out less production. And when that happens, then when you have a large population, then low productivity would mean that larger areas are required to feed that population. And so we find a direct correlation between poverty and the loss of natural resources or overexploitation of natural resources. Now, here it is important to emphasize that yes, we do have overexploitation of natural resources even in a developed society. But primarily, what we have observed is that the forests that are converted into agricultural fields is much greater than the forests that are converted into other resources in a more developed society. That is to speak, when the agricultural productivity increases because people have access to more resources and they can go with a more modernized agriculture, then the yield increases. And in a number of cases, it has been observed that when the yield increases, then the society requires less amount of land to feed the people. And then the society also starts turning a few of the agricultural fields into forest or say things like agroforestry. Now, in the case of agroforestry, the crop fields are also planted with trees, and so you have trees and the crops that are growing together. But this is only possible when the agricultural productivity increases, which is possible when people have sufficient access to resources like fertilizers, pesticides, high yielding variety of seeds, and agricultural implements. But when that is not there, then the poverty continues. Another thing that has been observed is that in the case of many poor societies that do not have access to things like healthcare, parents find that a large proportion of their children die before reaching adulthood. And so, as an insurance to ensure that at least some of their children reach adulthood, people start to have more number of children. So when the death rate is more, because people do not have access to hospitals and modern medicine, then that also increases the birth rate, and which is what we observe in the in the primary stages of demographic transition: high birth rates and high death rates. And in a number of cases, when people start to get some amount of medical care, the birth rate remains the same as before, but the death rate decreases, which is where a large portion of our current world today is. So people are getting access to more modern medicine, modern healthcare, but in a large sections of the society, the birth rates are still high. So excess of births and less deaths or lesser deaths as compared to the previous generation means that the populations also increase. And when populations increase, this also further aggravates the poverty because again, the per capita resources are even lesser. Similarly, when people do not have education, then also we find that more number of children are born because people need to be enlightened about such concepts. And so, in a large number of poor societies, we find that this vicious cycle goes on continuing. Now, when you have this vicious cycle, then you will find that the environment is being overexploited. And one way to stop the overexploitation of the environment is to bring these people out of poverty. And so, because poverty has a very intricate relationship with conservation, so the study of poverty becomes important for the study and practice of conservation. And so, in these lectures, we looked at what causes poverty, what causes low wages, what keeps these people in a poor state, and we found that there are several factors. So one is that when we look at the market for the factors of production, now these are the markets where the firms buy and the households sell, and the households are selling land, labor, and capital. So if we talk about the sale of labor, that is, people make their labor available for wages, then what determines how many people will get employment and what will be the wages that they will get. So to understand that, we looked at the demand and supply in the labor market. So the labor market is like any other market. You have a demand curve, you have a supply curve, and the point where both of these meet gives the equilibrium. And that equilibrium gives us the number of people that will get employment in this market and the wages that they will receive. And when the wages are set, then the next question is how many people will get the employment. That will also depend on what is their productivity. And in that context, we looked at how a profit maximizing firm determines how many labor to employ. And here we looked at when the number of workers increases, the output increases because more number of workers means that the total production will increase. But then this total production does not increase at the same pace. So when we move from one labor to two labors versus when we move from 50th labor to 51st labor, the changes are very different. When we shift from one worker to two workers, the production increases by a larger amount than when we are shifting from 50th to 51st worker. And this is known as the law of diminishing marginal product. So marginal product is the change in the quantity of output divided by the change in the number of workers that are employed. And we have seen that a lot of rational thinking occurs at the margin. And so the profit maximizing firm here again thinks, okay, what is the marginal profit that I'm getting by employing these laborers? And that marginal profit is given by the value of the marginal product of labor minus the wages. Now, this again is a simplification because in a number of industries, we will also subtract things like raw materials or things like the cost of capital or the cost of land. But to simplify things, we are taking that everything else is zero and we are just considering what is the marginal profit if we have an extra worker. And here we find that because this is a competitive firm, so in this case, the price is fixed. And with a fixed price, the marginal product of labor is directly proportional to the value of the marginal product. So there is a correlation between both of these, and that is a direct proportion. So if you multiply the marginal product of labor with the price, then we will get the value of the marginal product of labor. So in this case, we are doing 5, which is the price, multiplied by 50. And that is giving us the value of the marginal product. So like 5 into 50 is 250, 5 into 40 is 200, and so on. Now, because of diminishing marginal product, the marginal product is decreasing, so the value of the marginal product will also decrease. But the wages, they are constant because they are determined by this demand and supply curve. So the number of workers that any profit maximizing firm will employ will be given by this marginal profit. And so if we subtract, so 250 minus 100 is 150, 200 minus 100 is 100, 150 minus 100 is 50. So what we are observing is that the marginal profit is decreasing as we move from less number of workers to more number of workers. And we will reach a point where the marginal profit is now zero, which means that before this point, if the firm hired one extra labor or one extra worker, then there is an increase in the profit because the marginal profit is positive. But after this point, when an extra worker is hired, then the cost of hiring is greater than the value of the marginal product of labor, which would mean that by hiring an extra worker, the firm will increase its losses or decrease its profits. And so the firm will stop here. The firm will hire no more than this value. And for any profit maximizing firm, we can compute what is the number of workers that will be employed by that particular firm by looking at such calculations. And we can also look at these things through curves. So we can draw the production function, which is the output per hour versus the number of workers. And it is getting flatter because here again, the marginal product of labor is decreasing with more and more number of workers that are being employed. So in this way, and the cause of this diminishing marginal product is things like crowding, insufficient access to equipment, chit chatting, and other things. Now, here we are not considering the behavioral factors. So, we will look at behavioral factors in a short while. So, the marginal product is decreasing, the value of the marginal product is decreasing, and if the wages are constant, then the point where the value of marginal product intersects with the wage line gives the profit maximizing quantity of the number of workers to be hired. Now, in this case, we saw that the demand for labor is dependent on the value of the marginal product. And so, the number of workers that are hired will depend on the marginal product of the labor and the price of the output. That is, if the labor productivity increases, so every labor is able to produce more number of output items, then the value of the marginal product of labor will increase, and so more number of workers may get hired. Or if the price of the thing that they are producing, if that increases, then also more people will be hired. Now, we in this context, we also talked about the supply of labor. And the supply of labor depends on the trade-off between work and leisure, or the value that is given to leisure. If people value their leisure much more, then they will be less inclined to work. It depends on things like social taste, whether women prefer to work outside home or not. At what age do people start to enter into the market? It depends on changes in the alternative opportunities, especially things like the agricultural season. It depends on immigration and movement of labor. If more people are immigrating into the area, then the supply increases. And here again, the supply and the demand curves tell us the equilibrium in the market. And we looked at shifts in the labor supply and we looked at shifts in the demand. And in both the cases, there are changes in the equilibrium wages and the equilibrium employment. And we saw that there is a similar market for land and capital. So land, labor, and capital are the three factors of production. And in this case, we had said that the amount that is paid to each factor of production is derived from the supply and demand for that factor. And the demand is dependent on the marginal productivity. And in equilibrium, each factor of production earns the value of its marginal contribution to production. And so, if there is a sector in which people are contributing more to the development of something or to the production of something that is valued high in the market, in that case, those people will be earning more. But if there are people who are contributing little to the manufacturing of something that is valued high, or they are contributing substantially to the manufacturing of something or the production of something that is valued very less in the market, in that case, those people will be earning less. And less earning would mean that these people might move into poverty. Next, we looked at earnings and discrimination. So, in this case, we said that apart from the neoclassical theory of distribution, we also have other factors, and these factors modulate the results of the neoclassical theory of distribution. One such factor is the compensating differential, or a difference in wages that arises to offset the non-monetary characteristics of different jobs. So, if there is a job that requires a night shift, or that requires working in conditions that are dangerous, or that are difficult, or that are dirty, then those people will be paid more to compensate for working in such difficult conditions. So, this is one difference. Another is the human capital, or the accumulation of investment in people, such as education and on the job training. And we look that with increase in education or with the increase in training, the income increases. And there are several factors why this income increases. One, it increases the marginal product of labor, because the people who are more learned, the people who are more trained, probably are at a much better position to understand any problems whenever they arise. So they will be quicker in solving the problems. And so the marginal product of labor increases. Then it is a compensating differential for the cost of education, both in terms of the opportunity cost and time. That is, if a person went for a higher education, that then this person spent many months or many years of his or her life in getting that education, and probably also left any income that he or she would have gotten if they were employed. And so, because it is a tough thing to learn more, to spend time and effort in education, so there is a compensating differential. And the third thing is that these are signals for the higher ability. Because if somebody has had an education from a prestigious institution and has good grades, it means that this person can say that, okay, I have these good grades from this prestigious institution because I am intelligent, because I am hardworking, because I am punctual. And these grades become very good signals for the prospective employers. Similarly, if somebody has worked in a prestigious company, this also serves as a very good signal. So we looked at signaling, and that there are two characteristics of signals. It must be costly, and it should be more costly for the lesser quality product or person. And education and training are good signals, because for a person who is not intelligent, or who is not hardworking or not punctual, it is difficult to have good grades on their grade sheet. But for those people who are intelligent and hardworking and punctual, then it is easier for them to have high grades on their grade sheet. So education and training become very good signals. Then ability, effort, chance, and appearance are four other things that determine how much wages will people get. So people who are good looking probably will get more wages, especially in those jobs that involve public dealing. Similarly, if there are two people who are same in every aspect, but one person has a greater ability, probably because of genetics, probably because of upbringing, or probably because of exposure, then that person might earn more. Or if everything is same, then the person who is working more will earn more. Or in certain cases, there are also chance factors involved. People who graduate during times of depression, they will earn less than people who graduate at times when the market is bouncing. So there are several other factors that also govern how much people will earn. Superstar phenomenon. So in certain fields, if there are conditions in which one person is at the top of the market, is providing a product that is very good, and everybody wants to have that product, and the market is such that that product can be made available at a very low cost, then we will observe things like the superstar phenomenon. Now, in the case of superstar phenomenon, the wages or the income that the superstar would be earning will be way greater than the income that anybody else in the same field would be earning. Good examples include actors or singers or sports people. Then we looked at the cases of above equilibrium wages. So in certain cases, the wages that are determined by the equilibrium in the labor market, which is determined by the demand and supply of labor, the people earn way more than that wages. That is, they earn much greater than the equilibrium wages. And this could be because of, say, a law that says that this is the minimum wage that you can offer to a person, or it can be because of things like collective bargaining through unions, or it can be because of above equilibrium wages being paid in the form of efficiency wages, in which case the companies or the firms pay more than the equilibrium wages so that the good workers are retained in the company. So we have different reasons for which by which there will be differences. Another cause is discrimination, in which people of uh, different races, ethnic groups, sex, age, place of birth, they are offered different wages. And while in some cases the discrimination gets solved by the competitive market, because the firms that care only about profits will make products at lower cost than firms that do discriminate. But in certain other cases, we might require uh, the role of the government. So, like in India, we have several provisions in our constitution and also in several laws that prohibit discrimination. And in certain cases, they provide for a positive discrimination for those classes that have historically been discriminated. So essentially, while the new classical theory of distribution says that the amount paid to each factor of production is derived from the supply and demand for that factor, and that in equilibrium, each factor of production earns the value of its marginal contribution to production, but then this is also modulated by so many different effects. Next, we looked at income inequality and poverty. So income inequality is the disparity of income distributions with a high concentration of income usually in the hands of a small percentage of the population. So in the case of income inequality, what we are saying is that even though the per capita income of the society may be high, it is possible that only some people will have this income or this wealth and the rest of the people will be poor. So that is, or such a condition is known as income inequality. And we have income inequality in this world. There are certain areas where the wealth is below $5,000, and there are certain areas where the wealth is above $100,000. And in this context, we looked at the income share in India. And if we look at the cumulative income share, if so here we have the deciles, and this is how much each decile is earning. And if we draw a straight line and we draw a curve that touches the top of all of these, then we will have this triangle that is divided into two portions, A and B. And Gini coefficient of inequality is given by A divided by A plus B. That is the area of this curve or the area of this triangle that is in this section above the curves. And this income inequality shows itself in a number of criteria, especially the economic and the social criteria. So those areas that have higher incomes will have people that have access to health, that have access to education. We will find that the infant mortality will be less, the maternal mortality rate will be less, the under 5 mortality rate will be less, the life expectancies will be higher, and typically more and more people will be employed, they will be educated, they will be enlightened. And so the income inequality is very important because it shows itself in a number of different socioeconomic factors. Then we talked about poverty. Poverty is a state or condition in which a person or a community lacks the financial resources and essentials for a minimum standard of living. And in this case, we talked about the absolute poverty and the relative poverty. Absolute poverty is when people do not have sufficient resources for a decent level of living. Whereas if everybody is having or not having the decent resources, even then in any society we will have certain people who have more resources and certain people who have less resources. And the people who are having lesser resources will be said to be relatively poor because they are earning less than the median income in that particular society or the country. Now, in the case of poverty, we define a poverty line, which is an absolute level of income set by the government for each family size below which the family will be deemed to be in poverty. And here we can look at the poverty rate or the headcount ratio, which is the percentage of the population whose family income falls below an absolute level called the poverty line. And if we look at the levels of poverty in our country, the headcount ratio has been going down. But if you look at the number of poor, then we will find that over time, the urban poor has increased in number a bit, then decreased, whereas the rural poor have been reducing in number, primarily because the poor people in the rural areas are also shifting to the urban areas. And when we talk about poverty, we can talk about several categories of poverty. There are some certain people who are always poor. That is, they are always below the poverty line. Certain others are usually poor. That is, at some points of time, they will be above the poverty line. Others are churning poor, which means that they are moving in and out of the poverty line. Other people are occasionally poor, which means that they are generally not poor, but sometimes they may go below the poverty line. And there are other people who are never poor. And income distribution and poverty rate don't completely quantify inequality because the what matters is the standard of living, which can be modulated by in-kind transfers or the economic life cycle. And in this case, uh, in certain cases, the person's normal income versus the income in a particular time may have an impact in the form of differences in the standards of living. So the standard of living is more determined by what is the normal level of income that the people are earning. And in cases when the situations become very dire, as in the case of a drought, then people can say borrow money from either a bank or from their relatives or from money lenders and overcome this small phases of life. So the average income that people are earning, it becomes more important. Now, here there is the normative question, should income be redistributed? And we have different political philosophies. We have the philosophy of utilitarianism that states that the aim of the government should be to maximize the utility. That is, maximum benefits for maximum number of people. And here the utilitarians would say that the value of money for a person who does not have any money is very large, but the value of money for a person who already has large money with them is not that large. And so the government should aim to redistribute the income, take it from the rich people and give it to the poor people so that the benefits of the society they get maximized. So that is the philosophy of utilitarianism. Liberalism, on the other hand, looks at government policies that should be just as evaluated by an impartial observer. And this political philosophy would suggest that yes, some amount of income distribution should be done, but we should not completely bring equality in the society so that people have an incentive to work hard to become rich. And we have the third political philosophy, which is libertarianism. And in this case, it states that once the rules of the games are established, the government should not alter the result. That is, it is not a function of the government to redistribute the income between the rich and the poor. So basically, whether income should be redistributed or not is not just an economic question, it is also a philosophical or a political question. And depending on which society people live in, there will be different policies that are being adopted. Now, in our country and in a number of countries, governments are trying to reduce poverty through use of minimum wage laws. But the thing is that it creates a surplus, or through welfare schemes such as old age pensions and disability schemes, negative income taxes, in-kind transfers, and anti-poverty programs such as Manrega program. Now, in the 11th module, we looked at practical issues in economics and conservation. And the first one is consumer choice, where we ask this question that, okay, there are certain products that have very less impact on the ecosystem. There are certain products that state that these have been harvested from sustainably managed resources, like sustainably managed forests. There are certain products available in the market that say that these products do not emit that high level of pollution. But the thing is, in a number of cases, these products are typically a bit more pricier in the market as compared to other products that have been harvested from an unsustainably managed natural resource or that are giving out a large amount of pollution. Now, the question is, when we want people to go for the environmental friendly options, do they actually go for it? So, what determines what the consumer would choose? Because what the consumer chooses ultimately governs what will be produced in the market. And in this context, we looked at several of these labels that talked about sustainability, but we also looked at discounts that are there on those vehicles that are BS4 vehicles. And so when we look at consumer choice, there are two things. One is the budget constraint, the limit on the consumption bundles that a consumer can afford. Means that a consumer cannot have each and everything that he wants, because there is a limitation on resources. There is a limitation on the amount of budget that this customer has, which is known as the budget constraint. And we saw the example of two products, samosas and lassis. If the budget constraint is 100 rupees, then only certain combinations of samosas and lassis can be bought. And in this context, we also looked at the second uh, criterion, which is the indifference curve, a curve that shows consumption bundles that give the consumer the same level of satisfaction. So essentially, if you have more of one and if you have very less of the second thing, then that would give you a certain level of satisfaction. But then when you have something that is of a very large quantity, then probably you are not deriving a very large amount of satisfaction from that. So in that case, you will probably reduce the quantity of what you already have in excess of and probably go for something that you already have very little of. And this would bring us to different indifference curves. So if this is an indifference curve, it means that this point or this point or this point or this point, all of these give the consumer the same level of satisfaction. And we looked at the marginal rate of substitution, the rate at which a consumer is willing to trade one good for another. And different points have different marginal rate of substitution, which is given by the slope at these points. So if you have any point and you draw a straight line that is touching this point, the slope of this line will give you the marginal rate of substitution. And at this point, it is a very flat line. At this point, it is a very vertical line. So different points have different marginal rates of substitution. Then we looked at different properties of indifference curves. Higher indifference curves are preferred because people want to have more of both the products. That is, in these two indifference curves, this one will be preferred. Then we said that the indifference curves are downward sloping because if one good is consumed less, the other should be consumed more. And the indifference curves do not cross because that would lead to a situation where A and B are giving the same level of satisfaction, B and C are giving the same level of satisfaction. But then in the case of C, the consumer is having both more of good 1 and more of good 2. And in the case of indifference curves, we say that more of the goods is preferred over less of the goods. And so this will create um, a serious error in because in this case more of both the goods will be the same as less of both the goods, which cannot be true. And so the indifference curves cannot intersect each other. And we also saw that the indifference curves are bowed inwards since consumers have more willingness to give up a good that they already have a lot of. So this is the general shape. Now the thing is, when you have the indifference curves and the budget constraint, then the point on the highest indifference curve that is within the budget constraint that should be chosen. And we also looked at two specific indifference curves, that is the perfect substitutes such as rupee notes and rupee coins. So in this case, the indifference curve is a straight line. And we looked at perfect complements such as right shoe and left shoe, in which case the indifference curves are at 90 degrees. And when we look for the optimum point is the line is the point on the budget constraint curve that is on the highest indifference curve. Because if the consumer wants to have this point, then the budget does not allow because the budget can only allow up to this much. And if the consumer chooses something like this, then the consumer could have chosen this point which has more of both the goods. And so this point is a more preferred option and it is within the budget constraint. So by looking at both at these three curves, we can say that the optimum point that is chosen by the customer is the one that is on the budget constraint line, but is also touching the highest indifference curve. And in this context, we looked at two kinds of goods. Normal good, a good for which an increase in income increases the quantity demanded, such as pizza, and there are inferior goods for which the increase in income reduces the quantity demanded, such as bus rides. Because if somebody is having more income, then probably they would not want to use the bus, they would probably want to use a taxi or they would want to use their own vehicle. So buses or bus rides are inferior goods because people demand less of them if they have more income. They shift to something else. And in this context, we also looked at the income and the substitution effects. Income effect is the change in consumption that results when a price change moves the consumer to a higher or lower indifference curve. That is, in this case, we are asking the question that if the consumer had more income, what would he or she choose? So if income is more, it means that the budget constraint line is shifted to the right, which means that a higher indifference curve can be chosen. On the other hand, we have the second thing, that is the substitution effect, the change in consumption that results when a price change moves the consumer along a given indifference curve to a point with a new marginal rate of substitution. So in this case, we are asking the question that if the income remains the same, but of the two goods, one becomes more cheaper, then what would the consumer have? Probably the consumer would want to have more of that thing that is cheaper. And in this case, the consumer is not shifting the indifference curve, but is moving along the same indifference curve. And we looked at this example of samosa industries again, where the price of samosa falls. And so, uh, in this case, when the price of samosa falls, then the income effect means that there is an increase in the effective income. So more samosas can be bought and more lassi can be bought. But when we look at the substitution effect, then samosas are cheaper as compared to lassi. And so more samosas can be bought or less lassis can be bought. And this will result in the final effect of more samosas, but more or less or equal amount of lassis. So this is the income and the substitution effect. And we also looked at the law of demand that can be derived from these curves. And there are two exceptions to the law of demand, the Veblen goods and the Giffen goods. Veblen goods are luxury goods whose demand increases with the price. Things like luxury cars that people want to show off. Now, if the price of the car reduces, in that case, it does not serve the purpose of showing off. And so people will demand less of it. Giffen goods, on the other hand, are inferior goods whose demand increases with the price. And we looked at this example of meat versus potato. So if the price of potato increases, the effective income decreases. And when the effective income decreases, people would want to have less of the higher price product and would want to have more of the lower price product. So between meat and potato, because potato is a lower price product, so people will want to have more of it. So even though the price of potato has increased, people will consume less meat and consume more potatoes. So this is an example of a Giffen good. And we looked at the salient points. Consumer choice is the branch of microeconomics that analyzes how consumers maximize the desirability of their consumption. Desirability is represented by indifference curves, and consumption is limited by the budget constraint. So in this case, what is happening is that when we want to have people shift towards environmentally friendly products, then we would also have to ensure that these products are available at not too high a price. So we can play with two things. We can play with the desirability uh, of the ecologically sustainable products by say means of advertisement or by means of education of people. So in that case we can increase their desirability, but at the same time we also have to be mindful of the budget constraint curves. So we cannot have the environmentally sustainable options that are too expensive. Now when we talk about things that are too expensive or less expensive, here is where the government can play a role. So if the environmentally sustainable option is too expensive, the government may give a subsidy, or the government may put an additional tax on something that is not environmentally too sustainable. So in that case, both the prices will come to a similar level, and that would urge people to move towards environmentally sustainable options. So this is how consumer choice helps us to understand how we can shift people to environmentally friendly options. Next, we had to look at asymmetric information and behavioral economics. And we said that in a large number of cases, people are not rational. And why are people not rational? Because rationality is bounded. And rationality is bounded because we have um, a dearth of information and we have a dearth of processing power. If we had all the information and if we had all the processing power and if we had all the time, then probably we would have made all the rational decisions. But in a number of cases, we do not have the complete information, we do not have sufficient time, and we do not have the processing power, because of which rationality becomes bounded. Now, when we have a dearth of information, it is known as asymmetric information. That is, if there are two parties in a transaction, one party knows more and the second party knows less. Now, the thing is, what are the mechanisms that are available so that there is a transfer of information from one party to the other party? So, this is the field of asymmetric information. And we looked at the marginal product and we said that in the real world, workers do not often perform when they are left unsupervised, which is known as moral hazard, a tendency of a person who is imperfectly monitored to engage in dishonest or otherwise undesirable behavior. So, in this case, what we are looking at is the impacts of psychology or the insights from psychology into economics. So, earlier we had begun with very simple models and we said that okay, everybody is a rational person, everybody is doing everything um, as so as to maximize their welfare or the surplus. But now what we are observing is that no, everybody is not rational and everybody is not trying to maximize their surplus. In certain cases, people are just shunning away from the job. And this brings us to moral hazard. And because of moral hazard, uh, we have an increase in the cost. So the uninformed party has to put in efforts to get the information out. So in the case of moral hazard, people will want to go for a better monitoring, have CCTV cameras, have more number of supervisors, or pay above equilibrium wages so that people work, or give delayed payments such as year-end bonuses. Now, all of these are adding to the cost of production. So all of these are bad for the economy. And when something is bad for the economy, it's bad for everyone. But still people have to go with these. Similarly, the second thing is adverse selection. In the case of adverse selection, people are in a position in which they can be easily duped. Such as if somebody goes to a used car market, the salesman knows a lot about the car, but the buyer or the prospective buyer does not know about it. So in this case, the salesman can try to sell a car that is not a good car. Now this is adverse selection. Now people can respond to adverse selection by saying that okay, this is a used car market, I'm not going to take any used cars, which is avoiding the market. Now, because markets increase the surplus and because markets are a good way to organize economic activity, if people start to avoid the market, it's not good for the economy. Or the other thing is that people can ask that the vehicle be inspected by a third party. Now, when the vehicle has to be inspected by a third party, now this is increasing the cost. Now, it would have been much better if the salesmen were honest. But because of psychological attributes, because of behavioral differences, there are a number of people who are dishonest. And we need to bring these characteristics into our economic models. So this is asymmetric information. And a way out is through signaling and screening. So signaling is an action that is taken by an informed party to reveal private information, such as advertisements or good grades on CV. So advertisement is a good signaling because a company that is making good products will probably have a larger share in the market. And if they have a larger share, then they would be in a better position to advertise their products as compared to another company who is not making good products and so is not having a good market share. They will simply not be able to afford advertisements, especially those on the television. And so advertisements become good signals. And there are two characteristics of signals. The signals should be costly and they should cost less for the high quality product. And so things like advertisements or good grades on CV, they become very good signals. The second option is screening, an action taken by the uninformed party to induce the informed party to reveal the information. That is, if you go to a used car market and if you tell the salesman that, okay, I like this car, but I'm going to get it inspected by a third party. And if the salesman says, no, no, sir, don't you trust me? Or no, no, sir, there is no need. We have tested this car. It means that there is something amiss. Otherwise, the salesman should have agreed. And so, by asking this question, that you want to get the car inspected by a third party and is the salesman okay with it, you are inducing the salesman to give out the information. So this is an example of screening. And in behavioral economics, we integrate the insights from psychology into economics. We looked at bounded rationality, we looked at heuristics. Heuristics are mental shortcuts, rules of thumb. How do you make a decision when you do not have complete information or when you have less time or less processing power? So in that case, we make use of things such as heuristics. Effect heuristic, whatever is the gut feeling, we go for it. Availability heuristic, whatever comes to the mind first is what we go for. Effort heuristic, how much effort are we putting into getting something is determining its value. Escalation of commitment, if you have already spent a lot of money, we will be in a position to spend even more. Familiarity is heuristic, if something is familiar, we prefer that. And bounded rationality often leads to cognitive biases, a systematic pattern of deviation from norm or rationality in judgment. So when we talk about cognitive biases, we are saying that, okay, we should have gone with the rational judgment, but because we have a dearth of time, processing power, or information, we often make mistakes. And these are cognitive biases. And these include things like confirmation bias. If you have made a view about something, you will only take in that information that supports your view and you will discount everything else. Halo effect. If something is positive in one area, we'll take that it is positive throughout. Horn effect. If something is negative in one area, we'll take it to be negative throughout. Now, these are different cognitive biases, and we need to be aware of them because these play a role whenever people are making decisions. Then we looked at the valuation of natural resources, and we looked at the classification of resources, biotic versus abiotic, potential, actual, reserve, and stock resources, renewable or non-renewable resources, and we looked at the economic value. Now, economic valuation is necessary to aid cost benefit analysis when we are giving up one thing for another, or to provide evidence to aid habitat conservation policies. That is, if we have a solid evidence, then probably we will be working towards conservation in a much stronger manner, or to evaluate the economic compensation that is legally required. If somebody destroys your forest, if somebody destroys the habitats, how much are you going to charge that person would depend on how much valuation you have put onto your habitat or your environment. And so we have to look at economic valuation. Now, total economic value is a sum of use value, which is when you are using things, and the non-use values when you are not using things. Use value is direct value that you are using directly. So if we look at things such as timber or we look at fuel wood, these are things that we are using directly. So these are direct values. Then we have indirect values that we are not using directly. Things such as watershed benefits or things such as support to the evolutionary processes or support to biodiversity. We are using them, but we are using them indirectly. And third is the option value, which tells us that how much is the value that we are deriving for just keeping the thing as it is, because we might use it in the future. That is the option value. Then non-use value are those values that we derive when we are not using the thing. Existence value. We feel good because something is existing. We feel good because there are giant pandas. We feel good because there are polar bears. Even though we might never go and see them, but just because they exist, we feel good. That is existence value. Altruistic value. Okay, I'm not deriving a value, but somebody of my generation is deriving a value. Somebody is getting employment because there are tigers in Kanha. So I feel good that somebody is getting employment. So that is an altruistic value. I'm not feeling good about myself, but I am feeling good that somebody is getting benefited. And we have the bequest value, what we are leaving for our children and our grandchildren, our future generations. So that is the bequest value. And we can do a computation of all of these values by the methods of valuation. And there are three accepted approaches. Market prices, in which case we ask how much are people actually paying. The second one is circumstantial evidence, such as what would it cost to replace this thing, or what is the cost of the next best alternative. If you do not have mangroves, if you want to put up a tsunami barrier, how much will it cost you to make that barrier? If forests are not purifying your water, what will be the cost of the water purification plant that you will build up? Or what will be the cost of the diseases that people will get if the forests are not purifying? That is the damage cost that is avoided. And the third approach is surveys or express willingness to pay, that such as the contingent valuation method. And in the last module, we looked at case studies, economics of protected areas. So we looked at what is a protected area, and in our country we have four things: national park, wildlife sanctuary, conservation reserve, and community reserve that are protected areas. And we looked at how we prioritize things. So species that are keystone species, that are very important species, umbrella species that have a large home range, and flagship species that people find themselves attached to. These are the species that need to be prioritized. And when we are doing conservation, we go for those species that are all three of these. They are keystone, they are flagship, and they are umbrella species. Then we looked at factors that drive species to extinction, and there are two methods to conserve wildlife: ex situ, which is off the site, and in situ, which is on the site. And in this case, we looked at the principles of reserve design. Now, principles of reserve design say that we should have big size reserves. We should have reserves that are closer together. We should have reserves that form a cluster and not a linear structure. We should have circular reserves. We should have connected reserves. Now, when we are making all of these different reserves, we need to also understand what are the benefits that we are getting from these. Now, remember that economic analysis is important because it aids us in making decisions. So, when we are creating a reserve, we also need to know what are the benefits that we get out of it. And these are the ecosystem services. The benefits people obtain from the ecosystems. These include provisioning services, regulating services, supporting services, and cultural services. And we can do a computation of all of these. So we have looked at the methods of valuation, and we can use those methods of valuation to compute what is the value of the ecosystem services that we are getting from the protected area. And when we do that, then say in the case of Panna Tiger Reserve, we get to this value that there is an investment multiplier of 1939 rupees and 36 paise. Now, this is telling us that if we invest into making a protected area, what are the returns? And the returns are pretty good. Then we looked at the economics of environmental disasters. And we saw that in the case of disasters, in a number of cases, the disasters are because of the greed of people, because they want to take shortcuts, because they want to go for cost cuttings. And we looked at the Minamata disaster, in which case there was a company, the Kiso Corporation, that was dumping untreated waste into the sea. And these untreated industrial waste or the spent catalyst, they contained mercury. And once mercury was put into the sea, then we started to see a large number of symptoms. Fishes started to die, cats started to perform suicides. There were neurological disorders in a wide number of people. And later on, when this problem had to be solved, there was a cost of billions of yens. And so, something that could have been prevented by, say, treating the chemicals before they are dumped into the sea, because that was not done. So, the cost of treating the things became very large. And it also included a large amount of human impacts, deaths, diseases, misery, sorrow. So these are things that could have been prevented. We looked at the RLC. Now, in the case of the RLC, it was a very large lake, and what the government of that time did was to divert the water into agriculture and especially in the production of cotton. Once that happened, the sea started to shrink because now water was not reaching into the sea. The area started to reduce. The water became more saline. All the animals, all the organisms that were living in that sea, they died off. And the RLC used to be a very good tourism location. Once the sea was gone, the tourism industry was gone, the fishing industry was gone. And at the same time, whenever there were dust storms, a huge quantity of dust and sand used to get into the communities and destroy the property. At the same time, people started to fall sick because now this area was too polluted. Now, here again, if people used the resources sustainably, then they could have prevented this. So, in this case, you can see that this is the size of RLC in 1974 and this is the size of RLC in 2016. Massive difference. We looked at the Bhopal gas tragedy. Now, in the case of the Bhopal gas tragedy, the companies were doing the cost cutting by keeping the methyl isocyanate liquid stored in large containers. Why run the plants again and again? They shut down the refrigeration unit. The plant was ill maintained. The sensors were not there. And whenever the gas leaked, there were preventive measures such as flare towers. They were all shut down. There were chemical baths, they were shut down. Scrubbing towers shut down. And people were completely untrained. People were not given the opportunity or training of how to respond. And because of that, we had thousands of deaths. And all of these were preventable deaths. Similarly, in the Love Canal tragedy, the industrial waste were dumped into the Love Canal. And later on, when houses came up on top of that canal, when the schools were built, then people were exposed to these chemicals. All of these were preventable things. If the waste had been treated, then such a disaster would not have occurred. And the remediation costs were too high. And these are still an issue. Another case that we looked at is the Delhi smog. Now, Delhi smog is being caused because of temperature inversion, because of the local weather conditions, but it is also showing us that there are preventable things such as stubble burning or things such as the vehicles, the vehicular pollution, or electricity generation. So we are observing that quite a lot of these negative consequences or the environmental disasters are occurring because either we are too greedy, we are undergoing an unsustainable development, or because we just do not pay heed. But then the consequences are suffered by us only. We, our children, our grandchildren have to suffer the consequences. So it is right time that we heed to these. So that's all for today. Thank you for your attention. Jai Hind.